On the morning of September 24th, 1869, the price of gold in New York had been artificially driven to $162 an ounce, roughly double where it had been 2 months earlier. Thousands of merchants, farmers, and businessmen across the country had borrowed money against the gold price. Grain traders had locked in contracts based on gold-denominated exchange rates. The entire economy was leaning on this number. Two men in a private office uptown were watching. They had spent the entire summer engineering this very moment, buying gold, squeezing supply, running the price up, dollar by dollar, week by week. They had the president's brother-in-law on the payroll. They believed they had the president himself neutralized. At 12:17 p.m., the U.S. Treasury released $4 million in gold reserves onto the market. The price collapsed in minutes. Fortunes evaporated. Brokers went bankrupt in the time it takes to eat lunch. One of the two men uptown had already sold his position hours before the collapse without telling his partner. Guys, thank you so much for clicking this video and checking out the channel. I'm Johnny Diggs. Let's dig into this. Before we get to the scheme, you need to understand who these two men were, because they are the most mismatched pair of co-conspirators in American financial history. And their personalities, they aren't just color. They're the reason the scheme worked and the reason it fell apart the way that it did. Jay Gould was the brain. In an era when railroad speculation was turning ordinary men into millionaires and destroying companies overnight, Gould was the one who everyone else was trying to read. He said very little. He moved quietly. He was not beloved. What he was, though, was precise, patient, and completely unbothered by the idea of ruining people if the numbers justified it. James Fisk was the face. Big, loud, theatrical. Fisk wore military-style uniforms he had no right to and threw parties that made the newspapers. He had a private opera house. He had a steamship line. He ran his offices out of a mansion on 23rd Street that he shared with his mistress, the actress Josie Mansfield. Fisk was the kind of man who, when he walked into a room, the entire room noticed, which was, for Gould's purposes, extremely useful. They had already worked together on the Erie Railroad, a scheme so brazen it deserves its own episode, and it'll get one. But the Gold Corner was completely different. The idea was this. Gold prices were determined by supply and demand. The U.S. government held enormous gold reserves. If the government released those reserves, gold prices fell. If the government stayed out of the market and you could buy up enough of the available gold, you could control the price. And if you controlled the price long enough, if you squeezed the short sellers until they had to buy gold from you at any price you named, well, you could make an incomprehensible amount of money. The only variable Gould couldn't control was President Grant, so he decided to try to control President Grant. What I want you to pay attention to in this segment is the layering, because Gould wasn't trying to bribe the president directly. He wasn't that clumsy. He was trying to build a situation where the president's own family created the pressure for him, without Grant ever knowing what was actually happening. The access point was Abel Corbin, a financier and Washington insider who had recently married Grant's sister, Virginia. Gould approached Corbin with an investment proposal. He let Corbin in on the gold trade, opened a brokerage account for him with paper profits, money Corbin didn't have to put in but would receive if the trade worked. Corbin was now financially incentivized to ensure that Grant stayed out of the gold market. He began doing something subtle and dangerous, nudging Grant's thinking, talking up the benefits of a high gold price for American exports, framing Treasury intervention as harmful to farmers. He wasn't asking Grant to do anything. He was just reshaping how Grant thought about the issue. Meanwhile, Gould worked a second angle. He arranged for General Daniel Butterfield, the man who controlled the New York sub-treasury and would be responsible for releasing government gold, to also receive a brokerage account with gold. Butterfield would later claim he didn't know what it was for. The congressional investigation found that somewhat hard to believe. By September of 1869, Gould had what he needed: a financial stake quietly embedded near the president, a financial stake quietly embedded in the Treasury, and 2 months of patient gold buying that had begun to push the price upward. He had not bought enough gold to actually control the market yet, but he had bought enough to make it look like something was happening. And in markets, perception is often enough to move the price. The corner was tightening. What gold needed now was for Grant to stay quiet long enough to finish the job. By mid-September 1869, gold was at $140 an ounce and rising fast. Short sellers were beginning to panic. Fisk was out front, loud, visible, buying publicly, talking to reporters, creating the impression of unstoppable momentum. Gold, well, he was quieter and paying much closer attention. Before I get to September 24th, if you're still watching, thank you guys for clicking this video. If you could like and subscribe to the channel, my team and I greatly appreciate it. It helps the channel out a ton. Every episode, I dig up a new file and pull it apart until you understand exactly how it worked and why it keeps working. We don't skip the mechanism. That's the entire show. Anyway, because here's what Gould noticed in mid-September that Fisk did not. Grant was getting suspicious. A letter from Grant's wife, Julia, had reached Corbin, a firm note telling him to stay out of the gold market and making clear the president was aware of what was happening around him. Gould could read the implication immediately. Grant was going to release Treasury gold. The corner was about to collapse. What Gould did next is the thing I want you to sit with. He told absolutely no one. Not Fisk, not Corbin, not any of the other speculators who had piled into the trade on the strength of Gould's confidence. He began quietly selling his gold position. At the same time, and this is the part that is almost breathtaking in its coldness, he kept his brokers buying publicly through Fisk-connected accounts. He needed gold to keep going up for a few more hours while he finished selling, so he kept the machine running, using Fisk as the engine. So on the morning of September 24th, gold hit $162. Fisk was still buying. The gold room was pandemonium. At 12:17 p.m., the Treasury released $4 million in gold reserves. The price dropped immediately to $133 in minutes. Every person who had borrowed to buy gold at $150, $155, $160 was instantly ruined. Brokerage firms collapsed. Banks, they called loans. Grain merchants who had sold future contracts based on gold-denominated exchange rates found their businesses worthless in a single afternoon. And James Fisk, still holding an enormous gold position when the collapse hit, found himself facing hundreds of millions in obligations he could not meet. Gold, he already sold. The aftermath of Black Friday was a congressional investigation, a ruined economy for farmers and merchants across the country, and two men who walked away largely free. The mechanism by which that happened tells you almost everything you need to know about the relationship between money and accountability in the Gilded Age, and honestly, in most ages. The congressional investigation found substantial evidence of manipulation. Butterfield was implicated. Corbin was implicated. Gould's fingerprints were on most of it. Fisk simply repudiated his contracts, announced he would not pay. He hired lawyers, said the trades were fraudulent, and that he was also a victim. This was audacious, even by the standards of the time. He owned hundreds of millions of dollars. He announced he wouldn't pay any of it. And then, largely, well, he didn't. Gould settled some claims quietly at pennies on the dollar. He made so much money on the scheme, the exact figure is unknown, that the settlements were noise. Grant emerged from the scandal with his reputation damaged. He had not been bribed directly. The investigation found no evidence that Grant personally profited, but the people around him had been used as instruments, and he had not looked closely enough at who was working near him or even why. It was one of several corruption scandals that would define his administration's legacy. Fisk died in 1872, shot by a business rival over a woman. Gould, well, he lived until 1892. He spent those 20 years buying more railroads, more telegraph companies, more newspapers. He became one of the most hated men in America. He was also one of the richest. No one went to prison for Black Friday. Not a single person. Every time I close a file, I ask the same question. Why did it work? The Gold Corner is a different kind of case than the ones we've covered before in previous episodes. Lustig and McGregor and Weil operated on individuals. They needed one person, or at least a small group, to believe them long enough. Gould and Fisk, they operated an entire system. Proximity. They never approached Grant directly. They put a financial stake next to him, inside his family, inside his treasury, and let proximity do all the work. Grant never received a bribe, which meant Grant never had to refuse one. Another piece is plausible deniability. Every piece of the scheme had a legitimate surface. They were investors. They were buying gold. Perfectly legal. The manipulation only becomes visible when you see the entire shape of what they actually built. And by the time investigators could see the shape, the money was already gone. But the third one is what this case really comes down to. Scale. When a fraud gets large enough, the consequences of fully addressing it become larger than the consequences of letting it go. Properly prosecuting Gould would have required untangling years of railroad, telegraph, and financial holdings that were woven into the American economy. It would have taken down companies, ruined shareholders, cost jobs. It was easier for the courts, for the government, for the banks to settle quietly, take the pennies on the dollar, just move on. And Gould, well, he knew that when he built it. The most dangerous cons aren't the ones that take your money. They're the ones that get so large that taking the money back costs more than losing it. That's not just 1869. That's the lesson of every financial crisis you've ever heard of. The scale of the damage becomes the best argument against accountability. And the people who build these things, well, they know that going in. Gould and Fisk built something so large that the system couldn't cleanly take it apart. Now here's what's interesting. Black Friday didn't invent that playbook. It refined it. The man who actually gave the playbook a name, who turned build a financial scheme so large it can't be prosecuted into a repeatable science, came about 30 years later. His name was Charles Ponzi. And here's the thing most people don't know. He didn't invent this scheme that bears his name. The scheme was older than he was. What he invented was something more dangerous, a way to scale it faster than anyone had before, using a financial instrument so obscure that even the government didn't understand what it was until it was too late. Next episode, you'll know exactly how he did it and why the name Ponzi, and not any of the men who came before him, is the one that actually stuck. Guys, thank you so much for clicking this video. I appreciate you supporting the channel. I'm Johnny Diggs. Let's keep digging.